In the very last topic, we were talking about how Augustine understood Christianity to be in part relating to Plato and in part relating to Judaism. But in fact, Augustine was a really smart guy and he was very highly educated and he understood very much about both Plato and Aristotle. That being said, the sections that we read were mostly about his Platonic ideas. So what I'd like to do now is move both in time and in geography up quite a bit. So I'd like to go from North Africa, where Augustine of Hippo was, into Central Europe. And I want to go almost 1,000 years when we go from Augustine into Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. And he's our next topic. And the reason to think about Aquinas at this point is that he introduces some very interesting ideas about how God works in an Aristotelian way. So let me back up, give you just a little bit about Aristotelian science here, a little bit about Aristotelian physics, and then we'll get into the text. So you remember from our previous topic on Aristotle that Aristotle offered a 4-step system for us to understand everything in the world. We observe the world, we apply logic to observations, then we consult the ancient authorities or consult the past, and finally we conclude. And in this little section that we're going to read or have read from St. Thomas Aquinas, he is very much interested in that second part, in that logical system. And it makes sense in order to figure this out when it relates to God, to figure it out in terms of how St. Thomas Aquinas saw the everyday world. Remember, this is before Newton. This is before any ideas of inertia. This is before even the idea of gravity. And so for all of the Aristotelian thinkers, a force was something that moved something else. So if it is Ben Roethlisberger throwing a football, or if it is someone, maybe Roy Halladay throwing a baseball, whoever that is, whoever is doing something, whoever is moving something, that has to be done with a force given to an object. And when the force is put on that object, it moves. When the force is gone from the object, it stops. So for Aquinas, all things that are moving will eventually stop. And things that stop need a new force to move it again. That makes sense, right? If I drop something onto the floor, it stops. If I throw a football, it stops. If I throw a baseball, it stops. Everything stops at some point. What goes up must come down. All of that makes good observational and logical sense. But then Aquinas thinks a little bit harder and thinks about what Aristotle said about this. And he says, okay, if there is something moving, then there had to be a force on it. If there is something that made that force, there has to be a force behind that, and behind that, and behind that. And he says, as you remember from the reading, that we can either go all the way back to something that moves but is itself not moved, or we have to go back ad infinitum. We have to go back to infinity. And he says the infinity thing doesn't make logical sense because you need to have some sort of beginning, right? Remember, he's a Christian. He believes in this idea of a beginning. And so he says it must be that God is the thing that is the prime mover. God is the thing that moves something else but is himself unmoved. He can make a change and not be changed. So therefore, for Aquinas, it's actually the science of physics that explains to us that there was this God before time that creates things that happen in time. And then once that happens, forces can move on one another, but God never had to have a force put on him.